Good morning. We know each other, and I've got to tell you, every time I'm here with you and have an opportunity to share the stories of the way that our community is becoming that different kind of church in the world, I'm glad. I'm glad today that I get to do that with you again. I'm going to be joined in a few minutes by some friends, members of this community. I've asked them to come and tell us some of their unique personal journeys into the brokenness of our world. I cannot wait to introduce them to you, have you meet them, and hear what they have to say. I'm hoping you've got one of these near you. If not, ushers are going to be coming down the aisle, as is our custom, and we'd just love to invite you to look into the Bible with us. As you know, we're working our way through Isaiah chapter 61. I don't know what this experience has been like for you, but I've got to tell you, it feels as though my insides have been stretched into new dimensions. I feel as though, thanks to our teachers, my sensitivity to the God I love and my awareness of the purposes for which I exist have been coming into fresh clarity and a fresh sensitivity of what that means for me personally. And I hope for you as well. All through this month, we've been exercised in our understanding of what God, through Isaiah, is trying to declare. So God is saying to us, this is who I am. Look at me. This is what I'm about. This is what I love to do. And along the way, He's helping us to discover what our true identity and purpose is as well. Our mission has been unfolded for us in recent weeks, and today we stop to see how God puts a name, a role, a title on the task that God's entrusted to us. And I get to share these moments with you together. Let's look at the verse in particular that's going to be the focus of our attention. That's going to be verse 6, but build up to it by reclaiming a little bit of the momentum of what the prophet was saying in the verses prior. And I'd like to start right at the end of verse 3, where they will be called mighty oaks. That part. Are you with me? Let's begin there. They will be called mighty oaks, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendor. See, this poetic language that we're so in love with opens our eyes and hearts to understand the reason why God has invited us into relationship with Him. He loves to put Himself on clear view through you and me for the display of His splendor. And last week, we had a moment with our teacher, Brian McLaren, to visit this text. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. Strangers will shepherd your flocks. Foreigners will work your fields and vineyards. And here we go. Verse 6, front end. Our parking spot for today. And you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of our God. You will be called priests of the Lord and named ministers of our God. Two key words that help bring into clearer view for you and me what our God-given identity and calling was meant to be about. It's as though God is saying, I've invited you and entrusted you to be my hands and feet, to reflect my voice and my way in the world, to become that compelling force for good that we love to celebrate as a Mars Hill family. Let's look at those two words together, those two descriptors, just for a moment. Priests and ministers. You'll note these words are not unfamiliar to us, and along the way our teachers have been helping us understand something of the essence, the flavor, the nuances of those terms. Priests carries with it the idea of someone who mediates between one and another. We could have said intermediary, couldn't we? The one who stands in between one and the other. And just saying this morning what God meant by that assignment. For as priests, we've been entrusted with the blessings of heaven, not for our own delight and pleasure, but so that through us others would be blessed. We mediate the blessing of heaven to earth. We could say, I think this way, by priests, we're understanding our role as servants of God who put Him on display in the way we live. A priest puts God on display by the way he or she lives. The other term is minister. And we're familiar with that language. We hear it still talked about in some sense in religious circles. We're much more familiar with it in governmental circles. It's a term that's used commonly. Why? Because in its essence, it means someone who is officially appointed to act on behalf of another. So let me choose as a representative word the idea of representation. Ministers serve as representatives, or we could say those who serve God by acting on His behalf in our world. Priests and ministers. If we were to sum it all up, try to condense it down into its most simple sense, I think we could put it this way. Our true identity and calling is to serve God and to serve others. Do you remember the moment when one of those Pharisee experts in the law was trying to trap Jesus, as they often did? In this particular moment, he spoke on behalf of his group and said, now Jesus, okay, if you had to pick one thing out of all of the scriptures that stands out to you more than anything else, what would be that one thing? What's the greatest commandment, Jesus? And you remember how Jesus responded? He thought for a while and he said, well, I guess I'd have to say, if I was to sum up everything that the prophets and Isaiah and the law were about, it would hinge on this one idea. It's about loving me, loving God, and loving others. Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second commandment, your neighbor as yourself. It's about serving others and serving our God. Now, every time I'm sitting where you're sitting and listening to someone talk where I'm talking about the idea of serving, if I had to be really honest with you, and I'm going to be right now, I'm feeling a bit uneasy. How about you? This serving thing, we know we should be more excited about it, but there's something built into us that makes us uncertain in this teaching moment. If you're like me, any of that nervousness is going through your own system right now, I just want you to know I think I understand. I really do. A few weeks ago, I had planned some personal time following a pretty intense conference. I was traveling on your behalf, and I knew I needed to catch my breath at this point, so I had gone on the internet and found a place before flying back where I could just be quiet for a few days. Now, I love the water, the ocean in particular. I want to hear waves. I don't know what it is about waves. I just am declaring myself to be a lover of the ocean. If I can be near the waves crashing on the shore, I love the sound of waves so much that my wife, for our last wedding anniversary, bought me one of those electronic machines. Are you familiar with these things? Brooknell, I think, is the name of the company, that recreates authentically the sounds of waves and rain and all of these wonderful things. Every night now, hit the button, waves. She put a little Post-it note on this when she gave it to me. She says, David, looks like we're going to have to wait a while for our kids to buy us the cottage on the sea, so here's, in the meantime. I love the sound of the ocean, and my favorite places in the world are where I can see and hear it. So I had hunted this place down. I looked on the web and found the Dunes Bed and Breakfast. Now, doesn't that just sound inviting? The Dunes Bed and Breakfast. I checked it out. Pictures, beds looked okay. You know, when we pick places to stay, especially a bed and breakfast, it's important to know what the location is and what the quality of the accommodations are going to be. And they looked fine. What I was completely unprepared for was the breakfast part. You know, bed and breakfast. I got up the next morning, walked out, thinking this would be just another day in my life, time to eat breakfast, and found waiting for me a table facing the ocean, clear view. Oh, are those dolphins? I sit down at this beautifully arranged table, and even as a male, I could tell artistry had gone into the display of the plates and the fresh flowers that were arranged there for me. Before me, an array of breads and jams and butter and yogurt and muesli, granola for all the rest of you, and coffee is being poured without me being asked. And I sat down, and the feeling of bliss started to come over me. I started to dig into the yogurt. Do I go granola, yogurt, granola, yogurt? And as I'm digging into these two things, a plate of fresh fruit appears, beautifully arranged. There was enough fresh fruit on that plate to feed this whole section. It was unbelievable. Bananas, pineapple, melons of every shape and size, and exotic fruits that I can't name, all there for me. I said, yogurt, granola, fruit. I was just plowing into everything, bread and jam, and I had my head down. I'm busy gorging on the stuff, and whoop, appears a plate of pancakes. I've realized at that moment that what I was experiencing could be the epic breakfast of my life. And I'm by myself. I'm not surrounded with any Mars Hill staff, so I could care less who thought what of me pigging out on all stuff. I'm going at it like crazy, and out of the corner of my eye, what do I spy? But the housekeeping crew that quietly, elegantly enters into my room. The door was right off of the dining room area, and as I continue enjoying my breakfast, I hear the quiet hum of the vacuum cleaner. The windows and doors are being opened. The fresh sea breeze is flowing through. Fresh linens are being put on my bed. In that very moment, the owner, I'm not making this up, walks over to me, and in mid-bite, he says, Mr. Stoner, can I cook you anything? I had to stop for a moment because I'm not a breakfast eater. I'm not. I'm a mug of coffee and, charge through the day. It's very unhealthy, I know, but it's a lifelong habit. I don't think I'm going to break it. But when breakfast is served to me, I find myself capable of rising to the occasion. So I've got the fork literally in front of my face, and I said, you mean there's more? He says, yes, sir. Eggs and bacon, and throw some mushrooms and little fried tomatoes on the side. And I said what every one of you, if you're honest, would have said. I said, sure. I was comatose by the time I was done with that breakfast. I could not plow another bite into my body. And the euphoria that came over me, the euphoria, the rightness of it all, it welled up from within me. The sense of having been created for this. I couldn't wait to come home and tell Wendy about it. You need to know Wendy to know what an insane idea that was. Everything about that moment, the universe was in its right place. People hovering around me, caring for me, meeting all my needs and whims, making my day great. I was made for that. I don't know about you. I love to be served. I do. I love it. I think you do too. You love to be served, don't you? The whole time I've been talking, where's your mind been? You've been thinking either about lunch that's coming, and this is a calculated risk. I accept the odds because I'm taking you somewhere and you may not come back for the next few minutes. You may be sitting there, but you're not going to be here. So you're either thinking about your lunch or you're thinking about a favorite moment that you lived alone or with a loved one where something like that happened, or dreaming about your next vacation. We love to be served. It feels so good. Hold on to that feeling. This is an officially sanctioned daydreaming moment. It may never happen again in your life. Go there. Get in touch with that happy place. You there? Now hold on to it. Hold on to it for a second. Imagine this. Imagine that it were possible to have the very same sense of delight and joy and well-being about yourself serving someone else, doing something nice or needful for someone else as being served. Imagine that were possible. Do you remember your first job? Remember the first paycheck you got? I don't know your story. Our family grew up out of the country. My parents were involved in international work, and so I didn't have the experience growing up that many of you have had in this culture, where access to employment, even as a youngster, is possible. No paper routes for me. I always looked longingly at my cousins and wondered, what that is like, to have your own money. In the world we knew, that kind of culture didn't exist. And so when we came back for high school, second oldest brother and me, Tim and I, and had our first jobs as high schoolers, I will never forget the day we got paid for the first time. We drove up to the bank. I'm not making this up. As soon as we cashed the whole thing. Now, I don't know, it wasn't that much, I'm sure, but it felt like a fortune to us. We pulled out and went to one of those parking places in the bank parking lot, and we just threw the money in the air. It was so amazing to us. Money, this is our own money. And couldn't wait to go shopping and buy gifts for our family. And the day we arrived back to where they were and brought with us those suitcasefuls of gifts, it probably wasn't all that spectacular, but back then it was amazing. And I'll never forget the high that we experienced in that moment as we watched our family open the gifts that we had purchased with our hard-earned money. Do you remember that moment? Imagine that it were possible for us to experience that kind of joy on a regular basis. You need to imagine it. We need to begin imagining it, because it's exactly the way God created us to live. It's exactly the dream He's dreamt for you and me as His children. He's always longed that we would begin tapping in more and more into the joy of giving that so completely surpasses the fun of getting. Imagine that were possible. Today, I'm appealing to you, if you're listening to me and have returned from your lunch appointment, we need to wake up to a possibility that's right before us. The Old Testament scholars who study this text have a way of describing the way that Isaiah is declaring this truth about our identity and purpose. They call it prophetic imagination. Prophetic imagination. Isaiah is exercising a prophetic imagination in his invitation to you and me to believe that that's what we were made for, to care about and serve others as the dominant orientation of our lives. It's prophetic because it stands against, it speaks out against, it challenges the established status quo of our day. In a world that's driven by consumerism and addicted to selfishness, aren't we? The prophet speaks out and calls the truth of the wrongness of that way of living out of us and says, imagine that it could be different. Prophetic imagination. Imagining that our lives could be so much richer and overflowing with gladness and fulfillment if instead of being oriented around us, our lives were oriented around others. Okay, let's stop there just for a second. Because I'm sensing a little pushback from you. You're probably asking yourself the same thing I struggle with. Isaiah, I want to believe this pitch. I want to take it in. I want to own it, but not entirely sure if what you're selling us about the joy of serving is fact or fiction. This prophetic imagination stuff sounds an awful lot like fantasy. Is it really real? Can I take you quickly to 4 connecting texts that start to create a fabric of trust and confidence that what Isaiah is inviting us to dream could be true for us is actually possible? We're not going to spend any time on these texts except just to connect with them. And the first one we're going to find 20 chapters earlier in the same book, Isaiah chapter 42. Want to go there with me? Isaiah chapter 42. We've already become familiar with what Isaiah is calling out of us in chapter 61. We've been called to be a servant people. And now notice how he describes Jesus, our Messiah, the promised King. Here, verse 1, here is my what? Servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. There is an inseparable, organic, spiritual connection between us and the Jesus we profess to follow. We are called to be a servant people, led by a servant king. Now jump with me ahead into the New Testament. Let's look at the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20. Matthew 20. And we're going to begin in verse 24. This is that amazing scene where Jesus and his disciples have there's a little problem with 2 of the disciples who are trying to angle their way into some special place of honor, to which Jesus responds. Verse 24. When the 10, that is the other disciples, heard what those 2 were trying to pull off, they were indignant about the 2 brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them." That's how the world handles authority. They lord it over us. "And their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Not so with us. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave." How radical is this? "Just as the Son of Man," Jesus speaking of himself, "just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." In Jesus' upside-down kingdom, the structures and systems of society are turned on their heads. Greatness is not measured by power or prestige. How is it measured? It's measured by humility and servanthood. Let's go one step further. One final text. Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. We're called to be a servant people, led by a servant king, citizens of a serving kingdom. Is there a pattern emerging? And now in Acts chapter 20. Listen to what Paul has to say at the end of some closing comments to the leaders of the Ephesian church. Verse 35. "In everything I did," he says, "I showed you that by this kind of hard work, that is, the work of our hands, we must help the weak, remembering the words the Lord Jesus himself said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" Jesus said that. I guess according to Jesus, there's no argument, there's no comparison, it's no contest. Giving is always better than getting. And there isn't a person in this room that doesn't, in some measure, tap into that truth in a moment like this. Hasn't it been that way for you also? I mean, it's fun to get. Nobody's putting that down. But giving trumps it every time. Orienting our lives around others is such a better way to live. We're called to be a servant people. We're led by a servant king, invited into citizenship in a serving kingdom. We're serving. It's the best way to live. I'm here today to report to you that Jesus' serving spirit and the prophetic imagination of Isaiah 61:6 is absolutely real, alive, and well here at Mars Hill. I wanted us to finish our time together today not just looking at the text, but looking at it in a way that helps us to see ourselves in it. Let's see ourselves in the text as we finish our morning's teaching together. 4 friends have joined me on the platform. They're members of this community. Let's do this. They're going to be sharing their stories with us. And I know how much we love honoring each one as they share the truth of their journey. Let's wait, okay? And do it together at the very end. And we'll let it go at that. The first voice, the first story that I'm so blessed to introduce you to is the one that Andy DeBoer is going to be sharing with us. Andy is one of our high schoolers. Andy, go for it, man.
All right. Hi, my name is Andy DeBoer, and I'm a sophomore at Hudsonville High School. Over the last year, I've had the opportunity to go twice to Guatemala on mission trips. They were family-friendly mission trips, which meant the teams of 20 were made up of mostly families. So about half of these groups were kids from the ages of 6 to 16. I was excited to be a part of this kind of trip because there would be kids my age to hang out with, and the work wouldn't be too terribly tough because there were little kids along too. Our main reason of going down there was to join an organization called Pray America in helping the poor, orphaned, and widowed of the Quiché region of Guatemala. The population is very large in this area that is very small. Because of years of violence in that region, there are about 70,000 widows in an area the size of Kent County. Many children in the area don't survive to the age of 5 because of malnutrition and disease. Pray America started a children's feeding program in 6 villages, feeding the children twice a week with a well-balanced meal of meat and vegetables. I never thought that 2 tamales, some rice, and a piece of meat could bring such a big smile to the face of a child. Every time I handed a plate of food to these Guatemalan children, I was stunned that so little could mean so much. There's no way that all these kids liked the food we were serving them, but every single kid wiped their plate clean. We also built homes for the widows of this area of Guatemala. A team can usually build between 5 to 7 homes in a week. This is because the homes are simple 12 by 12 wood construction with a shed roof, a cement floor, 1 door, and 1 window. They are similar to the sheds that most people here have in their backyards to house their lawnmowers. The women were so thankful they usually wept when we blessed their homes with prayer and handed them the keys. I remember one widowed woman with several children who had spread pine needles all over the floor of her new home and had tied fresh flowers to the porch posts as a welcome to us when we came to bless her home. This type of greeting is used only for those of highest honor or for special occasions like funerals and weddings. We were speechless that she would actually do this for us. These trips to Guatemala have affected me greatly. Not only did they give me a heart for the truly poor of the world, but it also made me look at things here in America differently. If I go to Arby's and order a meal for $5.95, I think to myself, I could be feeding a kid down in Chepacal, Guatemala for a month with the money I'm using to feed myself for a single meal. This knowledge sometimes gets annoying. I mean, sometimes I just feel like putting down 5 Arby's melts. But I don't think these feelings are ever going to leave me. My parents often say with knowledge comes responsibility. And now I am asking God, what is my responsibility to the poor of this world? And how can I live my life differently to make that happen?
Thanks, Andy. Hey, Andy, before you hand the mic over, we're going to save that happy applause. Where'd you come back from last night? Tell us about that.
For the past week, I was down in Mississippi with the senior high group and helping out with the Katrina relief that's going on down there.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing your story. I'm now going to introduce you to a wonderful couple and leaders on our Go team. This is Marcy and Jerry Snyder. Marcy.
I am a stay-at-home mom of 2, and I work full-time as a licensed daycare provider. I began my involvement with the Sahrawi 5 years ago when the ambassador to the U.S., Maulud Saeed, spoke at Mars Hill. I had been invited to hear how Mars had become involved in serving the Sahrawi and why. Even though I had no desire to be at this event, I decided to go. For reasons I later came to understand, God plunked me front and center to listen to Ambassador Saeed. I look back now and fully understand that that evening God called me to become part of something bigger than I could ever have imagined for my life. As Ambassador Saeed told the story of the Sahrawi people, God spoke directly to my heart. His calling seemed impossible to me in that moment and in the weeks to come. I debated if I should tell anyone or keep to myself to save the embarrassment of sounding nuts. God told me that I would bring some refugee children to West Michigan for the summer. I thought this was crazy. Why me? Why here? And more than anything else, how? God was calling me to make a difference for the kingdom among the Sahrawi. After discussing this with the global outreach team, God laid on my heart that I needed to experience what life was like for these children, and I began preparing to take a trip into the refugee camps. My husband, Jerry, was very concerned that he would become a single dad if I went to these refugee camps. And my extended family told me that our daughters were too young for me to leave them and go on a trip that they saw as dangerous. In spite of this opposition, I took my first trip into the Sahrawi refugee camps 1 year after God called me to serve the Sahrawi. And 2 months after returning from the camps, I coordinated a summer program that brought 12 Sahrawi refugee children to West Michigan. That first trip into the refugee camps changed my life forever. I expected to encounter a people group with no hope, full of despair, people whose hearts were dying inside, but I was wrong. These people have a great hope for a better future. They have stayed together in order to maintain who they are and hope to one day return to their homeland together. These are a compassionate and giving people. They are surviving in harsher conditions than any human should ever have to endure. And they are teaching me what it is like to be human. How is this possible? 3 trips, 2 children's programs, and 5 years later, God continues to guide our family on a beautiful journey of joining Him in serving the Sahrawi. However, this journey did not always unite us in our marriage. For years, I wondered if God would ever call Jerry to serve in the camps in the same capacity that he had called me 2 years ago. I must admit that there were many times that I thought it would never happen. He had been using Jerry in his own way, and Jerry knew at that time God was not calling him into the refugee camps. He was calling him to transport Sahrawi children to Michigan for summer programs. Jerry loved this responsibility, and God used it to develop an unexplainable love for the kids of the Sahara Desert.
My first encounter with the Sahrawi children was transporting the kids for the summer program to the United States to stay with families in West Michigan, Texas, and Wisconsin. These children are from the western desert of Algeria, one of the most desolate and remote places on the planet. The kids were dirty from lack of running water. They were washing themselves in sinks in the airport bathrooms. Yet they were beautiful. Their deep brown eyes grabbed a hold of my heart, and I knew that God had called me into my own level of serving the Sahrawi. On a trip with 5 adults, only 1 spoke Spanish, and 43 Arabic Spanish-speaking 11 to 15-year-old kids, 72 hours of crazy travel, a 24-hour layover spent hanging out and sleeping in an airport, God allowed us to connect in a way that I cannot explain. This past March, I finally joined Marcy on our first trip into the refugee camp. A few days into our stay, as we walked from our host family's homes to the reception center where the teams gathered, Marcy looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked, "Now do you understand?" I finally was experiencing what her heart had been experiencing for years, seeing what she had seen, hearing what she had heard, touching what she had touched.
Our hearts are finally one for the Sahrawi people. And in March of 2007, Lord willing, our 2 daughters will join us in the refugee camps. Having watched their parents for the last 5 years, they too are passionate about serving the Sahrawi. I often ask God, why us? Why a stay-at-home mom from Jenison? Why 2 people with only high school educations? Why us with moderate income? Why parents with young children? He never gives me a clear, defined answer, but he always keeps passion burning in our hearts for justice and freedom for the Sahrawi. Freedom for them to have their homeland back. Freedom for them in Christ Jesus.
Marcy and Jerry, thanks so much for sharing that story with us. Now, you also just came back from something related to the Sahrawi yesterday.
Yes, I was able to, along with Keith Sparzak and Jody Lewis, spend a day on Capitol Hill in D.C. advocating on behalf of the Sahrawi, along with members of Congress and other local churches and other agencies who have been fighting for freedom for the Sahrawi for the last 20 years.
Beautiful. Thanks a lot. The mic is being passed now to our final guest and storyteller, and this is Amy Shepard. Please introduce her to you. Amy.
A year and a half ago, I was invited by Keith Sparzak and Steve Mayer of Global Outreach to join a team for a 2-week trip to Rwanda. What a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I promptly said no. You see, along with the heart God has given me for AIDS in Africa, He has also blessed me with a husband, 3 young boys, a full-time, high-stress job, a mortgage, a dirty kitchen, and lots of laundry. 2 weeks later, my Global Outreach friends asked again, as if they hadn't heard me say no the first time. I desperately wanted to go, but I emailed them back, saying that it was impossible for me to travel out of the country in May and June because of my husband's work schedule. The instant I said impossible, God stepped in with blessings and promises to fulfill this desire of my heart, to love on the people of East Africa while still being a good mom, wife, and business person. The first sign of God's favor was our favorite teenage babysitter asking if she could do her part for AIDS in Africa by watching our kids so I could serve in Rwanda and Scott could work. Many more blessings followed. Ultimately, I went on that once-in-a-lifetime trip. Although I knew God was calling me to this, I won't pretend it was easy. My husband was concerned about my safety. My 3 boys and I cried ourselves to sleep the night before I left. Even flying over the Sahara on my way to Kigali, I wept at the thought of never seeing my family again. I found Rwanda and her people to be beautiful and gracious, though they live with such a horrific past and a current reality that's not much better. Our team built houses for widows. We visited the sick in the hospitals. I prepared and taught my first sermon to a group of moms just like myself. The only difference is they have AIDS and have become prostitutes to keep their children from starving to death. Despite my experiences, I had a sweet peace about me when I returned, happy driving my Yukon, comfortable in my new home with my little family, deeply in love with the people of East Africa, and yet very, very content here in West Michigan. But after a month, I was restless and frustrated, and I prayed to God to show me what was next. A few days later, Keith and Steve asked me to meet with them. Mars needed a point leader for East Africa, and would I consider taking on this role? This was a much larger answer to prayer than I thought our family could handle. I essentially left the decision up to Scott, because if I took this volunteer position, the brunt of caring for our boys and our home would fall to him if I was traveling or wrapped up in meetings. I expected him to say no. But he surprised me with his deep well of faithfulness and obedience to God that I don't always give him credit for. So for the past year, I have been the Mars Hill East African point person. In this role, I have been a part of the team that facilitated our community's beautiful sponsorship of nearly 1,400 Rwandan children through World Vision last November. I have participated in strategic partner meetings with World Relief in Burundi and Baltimore. I have been blessed with people here at Mars Hill who wish to be involved in many ways serving the people of East Africa. All beautiful things that I believe God is calling me and us to do. Yet I've also had to cancel team trips to Africa because we had fewer than 10 people from this community able to serve. And we've held refugee meetings with less people attending than are in the families we're trying to help. Burned out and frustrated, I've wanted to quit. But sometimes simple things keep me going. People have helped by giving my husband and I a date night or by simply cleaning our house. Lately, I've been learning harsh personal lessons about the complicated struggles of refugees in our own small city. I've realized how mistaken my arrogant assumptions are about people's lives improving once they come to America. My experiences with local refugees have been as shocking and as foreign as my time in Burundi and Rwanda. An East African family we have come to love and support was recently faced with a marital separation, HIV, homelessness, and abuse. When I first heard about this, I felt so alone, overwhelmed, and certainly out of my league dealing with it. Eventually, I cried out to God to raise someone from this huge community of 12,000 to help, just someone to lift the burdens I shared with these refugees. And He answered my prayers. With a great family who opened their home and guest bedroom to a mom and 2 kids, with a whole neighborhood network that stepped up, supplying everything from toothbrushes to driving lessons, and stepping in when I simply had nothing more to give. Refugee families need someone to explain how a checking account works and how to cook on a stove. They long for an American family to come alongside their family in simple yet committed friendship. Of all my experiences, both here and in Africa, one of the most beautiful has been bringing a refugee family to church with us. Yes, they live 30 minutes in the wrong direction, but having their son go to preschool peer with our son and sitting in the great chairs with my husband on one side of me and the family on the other is a simple, complete joy. Yet, the roller coaster ride continues. This past May, I was kept home from leading a team of women to Rwanda because of an unexpected health challenge. I was heartbroken and profoundly confused when the team traveled without me. Why had God taken me so far with this team, only to keep me home? But 2 amazing things happened here while the team was away. I received a call from someone in the Mars Hill community asking if I would advise them through the process of selecting a program to donate money for in East Africa. Ultimately, this person committed to invest in a church mobilization HIV/AIDS program in Burundi. 85% of the program's annual budget was funded with this $50,000. Now, pastors and youth are learning that their churches can be a place of help and healing rather than judgment and ignorance in the face of AIDS. All through one person in our community following God's commands and giving sacrificially. At the same time, the overpacked life my family leads really began to take its toll. My husband and I began to ask ourselves, how can we have more freedom to follow God? If we wanted to continue serving, we knew we would need to shift priorities and make changes. We decided to sell our new home that we built just a year ago and move back into an old farmhouse that we also own. I realize that stories of downsizing are not uncommon here at Mars, but I've always heard those stories and thought that we would never be that strong, that selfless, or that aligned at the same time. Yet now we are, and it humbles me.
Is that okay?
That's great.
Aren't you glad, by the way, to be inside right now? I did leave the windows open on mine, so it's going to be fun getting out. Maybe you did too. Listen, it's too late. Just relax. Just relax. You do not want to rush to wherever you're going next into that stuff, do you? So this is perfect. Do you remember how we ended up last week? Brian McLaren was talking to us about Carter, the taxi driver from Baltimore. Amazing story. Just a normal guy with a normal job like you and me who decided to turn it into something focused and useful for the kingdom. And because he's serving a community in Malawi, that place is never going to be the same. Carter. I wanted you to know we have our own Carter, the taxi driver kind of people too. You knew that. And we needed to celebrate that together as a family. I wanted you to know about Andy, high school student, and a couple moms like all of you moms out here, and a dad with a normal job and concerns for his family just like you do. People who are believing the dream and hearing the call of God through the prophet Isaiah are testing the water and discovering that serving is better. Priests and ministers are in our midst. Am I describing you? Am I describing you? I want you to know, in the worst possible way, I want you to experience what these friends and others in our community are discovering, that serving is better. In our community, there are needs that are uniquely suited to the size of your body, your gifts, your passions. Did you know that still this fall we need 200 additional helpers in our children's ministry? When everybody gets back from vacations, you know what happens to this place. It just is bursting at the seams, and we want to be able to serve those families and kids well. We take that seriously, but without your help, we may not be able to do so. I am appealing to you. Do you enjoy kids? Do you love kids? Do you have kids? Is it in your heart to serve in that way? Would you explore that possibility today? How about men? Our student ministries in all areas, 56 Element and high school, are desperate for your presence in their midst. You don't need to know the answer to every difficult question. Nobody does. What does a youngster need? What does a young man, a high schooler need? He just needs a friend that he can trust, someone who's genuinely caring about them. I've got to believe that I'm talking to men who could be that kind of friend and mentor to students. Your help is desperately needed. In every area of our community, there are opportunities that are uniquely shaped to what you could contribute. Priest, am I speaking to you? Are there any ministers in the house? We just can't wait to have you join us. And of course, I've got to tell you that that is certainly true of our global team. They, along with leaders from children's and students, are going to be at the Welcome Center. They've got information to share with you. You can step up, grab a piece of paper, and walk away. Read it when you get a moment. Think about it. Open yourself to the possibility. Imagine that it could be you meeting the need of someone in our community. We're learning to say to one another here at Mars Hill, how will we ever make a difference serving in the world somewhere else if we don't learn how to serve here first? You know, that makes sense to me. Does it make sense to you? Let's be that kind of community. So our global team is also going to be out there, excited to interact with you, share information about upcoming learning and serving opportunities. And then right across the hall, since you may be inside waiting for a while until the downpour ends, there's food. Just want you to know. Food over there from East Africa, made by Rwandan friends from East Africa, right, that have been cooking for us yesterday and today. You've got to stop by and hear more of the stories of servants from our community. Enjoy some of that experience. See pictures. Eat good East African food. Sound good? All right. Let's stand together, shall we? If you came prepared with an offering, because a part of the way that you and I serve God's purposes here is by serving through the money He's entrusted to us. So if you came prepared with an offering, there are joy boxes on the way out. I thought it would be great if we finished today reading out loud together words that have taken on a deep meaning for us from our covenant, the section on serving. And when we're done, you can go. Let's read it together, I hope. Not up? It's out? Guess what? I don't have a copy of it. You know that section about serving and it's just a wonderful thing to do, that whole thing? It's recalling how much we... Oh, you've got it. I can at least read it to you. Thank you. Oh, this is awesome. Hey, this is just about as good, not as good as having you read it with me, but make it your own, okay? Make it your own. We believe that Jesus is God in human form, and that the church is God's ongoing presence in the world. Led by the Spirit of God, Mars Hill is passionate about relieving suffering and fighting injustice, joining the God of the oppressed in living out the transforming message of the resurrected Jesus. Jesus calls His church. Jesus calls Mars Hill to be a compelling force for good in the world. And we believe that the church is at its best when it serves, sacrifices, and loves, caring about the things God cares about. We were created to live for something larger than ourselves. And all God's people said, amen. All right, go get wet. Now, don't forget, stop by the Rwanda team. They would love to share some good food and conversation with you. Have a great week.